The Apache chief found his wife's killer and gave him a horse instead of a bullet. The wind moved low across the red earth as the Apache chief reached the narrow pass where his scouts had found the man responsible for the wound that had taken his wife from him 2 winters before. A wound delivered in fear rather than malice, but fatal just the same. And as he dismounted at the foot of the canyon wall, the grief he had learned to carry like a second spine pressed sharply beneath his ribs. The man was not bound or beaten when the chief approached, only standing very still beside the dying fire he had kept through the night, his hat in his hands, his face hollow with waiting, and his eyes fixed on the ground, as though he already knew the shape of his punishment. The chief studied him in silence, seeing not a warrior or an outlaw, but a ranch hand whose trembling hands and uneven breath marked him as someone who had not slept since the truth had found him. For guilt had a way of digging deeper than any arrow, and this man had lived with its weight longer than most men survive their own remorse. The chief stepped closer until only the fire separated them, the flames twisting in the wind like memories refusing to settle. And he spoke the woman's name aloud for the first time in seasons, watching the man flinch at the sound of it, the syllables heavy with the sorrow of a life undone. The killer lifted his eyes then, not in defense, but in surrender, whispering that he had hoped for this moment, if only to let the truth stop chasing him across fields and dark roads. For every sunrise had reminded him of the life he had taken and the family he had broken. The chief felt the old anger rise, sharp, clean, familiar. But beneath it lay the deeper ache of knowing his wife had died, helping a frightened man escape a cattle stampede he had not meant to start, and that her last act had been mercy, not fear. The fire snapped in the wind, scattering sparks into the morning air, and the chief lowered his hand to the knife at his belt. Not to draw it, but to feel its weight and decide whether grief would shape the day, or whether he would honor the woman who had given her life to saving someone who never meant her harm. The man waited without moving, his breath shallow, his shoulders bent not from expecting death, but from being willing to receive it. And in that fragile stillness, the chief understood that he had come to the place where justice and vengeance parted paths, and only one would carry his wife's memory with the dignity she deserved. The chief did not speak at once, for silence often revealed more truth than questions. And as he stood across the fire from the man who had taken his wife's life, he let the morning settle around them. The low rustle of mesquite leaves, the distant call of a hawk rising over the canyon ridge, the crackle of embers drifting into the pale dawn sky. The man shifted only once, as though fighting the instinct to kneel. But he forced himself to remain standing, his voice breaking as he told the chief he had replayed that day 1,000 times, wishing he had been braver, quicker, wiser, anything that might have spared the woman who had reached for him when fear had frozen his limbs. The chief listened without interrupting, his expression carved from patience and old hurt. For he had witnessed many men lie to save themselves, and many others speak truth too late to change its shape. Yet the trembling in this man's voice held no deceit, only the brittle honesty of someone who had not known how to carry the weight of what he had done. The chief remembered the day his wife had been brought home, remembered the way her hand still held the leather reins she had rescued from the stampede, remembered how she had spoken with her last breath of a man who had fled, not from her, but from the terror of hooves exploding across the dry ground. As he stood now in the smoky quiet, he watched the man before him, sleepless, gaunt, and worn down by remorse. And he saw not a murderer hiding behind excuses, but a frightened ranch hand who had become his own prison long before the chief ever found him. Behind the chief, 2 Apache warriors waited by their horses, watching with the stillness of those who understood this was not their moment to speak, only to witness the decision of their leader. The chief's gaze drifted to the canyon floor, where the wind moved the dust in slow spirals, and he felt the weight of a choice settling into his bones. Not the decision of whether to kill this man, but whether to allow grief to decide in place of truth. The man swallowed hard, whispering that he had no right to ask for forgiveness, only the courage to stand where he would not run anymore. And the chief studied him with the calm of someone searching not for guilt. He already knew that, but for the shape of a soul that had been breaking long before the sunrise. He saw exhaustion, fear, honesty, and the faint outline of a man who had carried his punishment across every mile he had walked since the accident. And though the chief had not yet chosen his path, he understood he was witnessing not defiance, but surrender, an offering of truth laid bare before the fire's last embers. The wind shifted sharply through the pass, carrying with it the sound of approaching riders long before their shapes appeared on the ridge. And the chief turned his head just enough to sense the danger that neither he nor the man beside the fire had expected to face. 3 armed ranch hands crested the rise, their horses lathered and restless, and from the moment they spotted the killer standing alone before the Apache Chief, their shouts echoed with the kind of anger born from whiskey, rumor, and the false courage of men who believed justice belonged only to their side of the river. The killer startled, stepping back instinctively as one rider raised a rifle and accused him of abandoning the ranch after the stampede, blaming him not only for the woman's death, but for the injuries several ranch hands suffered when the herd scattered. And the chief moved between them without hesitation, placing his body as a barrier while lifting one steady hand toward his warriors to hold their ground. The ranch hands demanded the killer be handed over, shouting that the chief had no right to interfere. Yet beneath their threats lay a tremor of fear. For even 3 armed men knew the danger of provoking Apache warriors when blood ran hot. The chief answered not with threat, but with authority, declaring that the man before them had come not to flee but to face the truth, and that no bullet would be fired while he stood there. When the nearest rider jerked the barrel of his rifle toward the killer, the man fell to his knees in the dust, not begging for his life, but forcing himself into the open where any strike would land on him alone, whispering through clenched teeth that no one else should pay for what he had done. The chief saw the moment for what it was, a man offering himself to violence not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate, broken desire to finally stop running from the consequences that had haunted him across 2 winters. In that heartbeat, the rescue took its shape. Not in the drawing of weapons, but in the chief stepping forward and planting his hand firmly against the rifle's barrel, lowering it with a calmness that froze the riders in stunned silence. He declared that vengeance in the hands of angry men was no justice at all, and that if blood was to be spilled that day, it would not be spilled without truth leading the way. The ranch hands, unsettled by the chief's refusal to yield and the unwavering stillness of the warriors behind him, grudgingly lowered their rifles, and in that fragile quiet, the killer realized he had been saved. Not from death alone, but from dying without having spoken the full truth of what happened to the woman whose memory the chief carried in his heart. When the ranch hands finally withdrew, muttering threats but unwilling to test the chief's resolve, the canyon seemed to exhale, leaving behind a hush that felt strangely protective, as if the land itself recognized the fragile balance that had just been preserved. The chief motioned for his warriors to remain at the perimeter, then guided the shaken killer toward a shaded overhang where the stone offered shelter from the rising heat, the fire's last embers glowing faintly behind them like memory refusing to die out. The man sank onto the ground with the heaviness of someone who had not rested in months, lowering his head into his hands as though the sudden safety was too much to bear. And the chief crouched nearby, neither comforting nor condemning, simply allowing the silence to settle around them until the man's trembling slowed. The chief brought him a water skin and a portion of dried meat, telling him to eat. For a man cannot face the truth on an empty strength. And though the man hesitated at being offered anything from the chief he had wronged, he obeyed with the humility of someone too exhausted to refuse kindness. As he ate in small, uneven bites, the chief studied him: worn boots, blistered hands, a face carved by sleeplessness, and the unmistakable slump of a man who had carried grief like a pack he believed he deserved to bear alone. The chief asked him to speak of what happened on the day his wife died, not to reopen the wound, but to understand the full honesty of the man before him. And the killer spoke quietly, telling how he had tried to turn the cattle from a narrowing gorge, how panic had split the herd in two, and how the woman had ridden into danger without thought for herself, pulling him clear of hooves that would have crushed him had she not intervened. He described her calm voice, her steady hand, and the moment she fell beneath the weight of the stampede he had failed to control. And as he spoke, his voice cracked with the raw truth that he had replayed that moment every day since, wishing he had been the one taken instead of her. The chief closed his eyes briefly, hearing his wife's courage reflected back through another man's regret. And when he opened them, the rage he had expected to rise did not come. Instead, something quieter took its place, an understanding that her last act had not been wasted. For she had given her life to save a soul who had spent every day since trying to honor that sacrifice through remorse, labor, and suffering. The canyon wind calmed, brushing dust across the fire's remnants. And in that fragile shelter, the chief realized that safety did not always come from walls or warriors, but from the quiet moment when a man's truth finally found a place to rest. The sun had begun its slow descent along the canyon walls when the chief shifted closer to the man and asked him, with the steady calm of someone who needed truth more than apology, why he had not returned sooner to face what he had done. The man swallowed hard, his gaze fixed on the dust at his feet as he confessed that he had tried, more times than he could count, to ride toward the Apache lands and offer himself. But each time fear overtook him. Not the fear of death, but the fear of standing before the husband of the woman who had given her life for him, a burden he felt too unworthy to carry into another man's grief. He spoke of long nights spent in barns and canyons, of whispering her name to the empty air as though she might hear his remorse, and of leaving small offerings at the edge of Apache territory, hoping the spirits of the land would deliver his unspoken sorrow where he could not. The chief listened with a stillness that did not waver, his face unreadable, though a faint softening touched his eyes as he realized the man had not hidden out of defiance, but out of a deep and paralyzing shame that had drained him far more than any punishment could. When the chief finally spoke, he told the man that running from sorrow only sharpens its teeth, and that grief shared, even between men divided by tragedy, lessens its weight, for it is not meant to be carried alone. The man nodded slowly, his voice cracking as he admitted that he had dreamed of the chief many times, sometimes angry, sometimes silent, and once even forgiving. But upon waking, he always found himself too broken to hope for anything, except the chance to speak before being cut down. The chief lowered himself to sit fully beside him, crossing his legs in the dust, and said that his wife had been a woman who saw good even in frightened hearts, and that if she had spent her last breath pulling this man from danger, then she had chosen him deliberately, with a courage that demanded to be honored rather than drowned in guilt. The man's shoulders shook as he covered his face, overwhelmed not by forgiveness. He knew he had no right to ask for that, but by being recognized as a human being rather than a shadow of regret. After a long silence, the chief placed a hand on the ground between them and said that today was not the end of anything, but the beginning of a truth that needed to be walked, not hidden. The man lifted his head, his eyes brimming with the weight of years spent alone. And for the first time since the accident, he felt something close to breathing freely. For the bond forming in that quiet canyon was not forgiveness, not friendship, but the start of understanding between two men who'd been shaped by the same loss in different ways. The quiet bond forming in the canyon was broken suddenly when one of the Apache scouts descended the ridge at full speed, his horse throwing dust into the air as he called for the chief with urgency that left no room for doubt. Danger was coming, and coming fast. The chief rose at once, the calm in his expression tightening into sharpened focus as the scout reported that a group of ranch riders, far larger than the three who had already confronted them, had been spotted heading toward the pass, their numbers swelling with every mile as word spread that the man responsible for the stampede was now in Apache hands. The killer's face drained of color as he realized these were not men seeking truth or even justice, but men caught between revenge, pride, and the bitterness of loss, and that they would gladly spill blood, his or the Apache's, if it meant satisfying their anger. The chief signaled to his warriors, who mounted swiftly, forming a protective line along the ridge, their silhouettes sharp against the late afternoon sun as they prepared for confrontation not of their choosing. The killer stood trembling beside the fire pit, torn between fleeing into the canyon or surrendering to the riders in hope of sparing the Apache from being dragged into a conflict rooted in his failure. But when he stepped forward to offer himself, the chief stopped him with a gesture firm enough to root him in place, saying that a man cannot run from truth 1 hour and throw himself into destruction, the next simply out of fear. Courage must be held long enough for justice to see its shape. The distant thunder of hooves grew louder, carrying the rising anger of men who believed that the only answer to hurt was more hurt. And the killer whispered that he never meant for any of this to reach another soul, that his guilt was his burden alone. The chief answered that guilt carried alone becomes poison, and that the riders approaching were not coming for justice, but for someone to blame loudly enough to quiet their own pain. Dust lifted along the ridge as the ranch riders drew into view, 15, maybe 20 men. Faces hard, rifles hung across saddles, their horses restless with excitement and fury. One shouted that the killer must be handed over or they would take him by force, and the chief stepped forward with a calm authority that silenced even the wind, declaring that no man would be taken without truth spoken and heard, and that if they sought violence, they would find warriors ready to withstand it. Tension coiled tight across the canyon, the space between the two groups narrowing with every breath. And in that charged stillness, the killer realized that the danger he had tried to shoulder alone was now pressing against the lives of men who had shown him nothing but patience and unexpected dignity. A truth far heavier than any punishment he had imagined for himself. As the sun lowered behind the western ridge and painted the canyon floor in long, thinning shadows, the killer felt the weight inside him twist into something nearly unbearable. For while the riders approaching were men he once worked beside, men whose respect he had shared and whose anger he now understood. The Apache warriors standing behind the chief had offered him more dignity in a single afternoon than he had allowed himself in years. He watched the two lines face each other, the ranch hands leaning forward with a hunger for retribution, the Apache warriors standing grounded and steady. And the sight tore him in two, for he knew he had become the spark between these worlds, the cause of a danger neither deserved. His breath came shallow, each inhale scraping against the raw truth that these men might kill each other, because he had been too afraid, too ashamed, too hollow to face the chief sooner. He turned to the chief with a trembling voice, insisting this was his doing, that he should walk out and surrender himself before blood was spilled on land that had already taken enough from the chief's life. The chief met his words with a silence deeper than any rebuke. His gaze steady, his breath calm, as though he were weighing not the man's guilt, but the shape of the path the spirits had placed before them. When he spoke at last, his voice was quiet but unshakable, telling the man that a life offered in fear is not a sacrifice, but a surrender, and that his wife had died because she stepped forward with courage, not because she fled from danger. The killer's heart clenched at those words, for even though he longed to give his life to balance the harm he had caused, he also feared dying before being truly seen, before speaking the full truth that had lived like a wound under every breath he had taken. He whispered that he did not deserve to be protected, not by the Apache, not by anyone. And the chief answered that deserving had nothing to do with it. Only truth, choice, and the path that honors the dead, rather than repeating the violence that destroyed them. The killer's knees weakened as the shouting from the ridge grew louder, ranch hands demanding an answer, their voices shaking the stillness like stones thrown against a sacred place. And he felt the pull of two instincts, one urging him to run forward and give them the death they came for, the other urging him to stay behind the chief and trust a wisdom he did not yet understand. The struggle inside him rose like a storm, tearing through the guilt, fear, shame, and longing he had carried across miles of solitude. And in that inner turmoil, he felt the truth settle like a final, steadying heartbeat. He could not choose the path alone. For this moment no longer belonged to him alone, but to the memory of the woman who had given her life in mercy, and to the man now deciding how that memory would be honored. The shouts from the ridge rose again, sharper this time, carried by riders who believed anger itself was justice. And the killer felt something inside him break free from the years of heaviness that had dragged him through every lonely dawn since the accident, pushing him toward a choice he could no longer avoid. Before the chief could speak, he stepped out from the shelter of the overhang and walked toward the open ground between the two groups, dust curling around his boots with each uneven stride as the ranch hands drew their rifles higher, startled by the sudden movement. Behind him, the chief called his name once, not as command, but as caution. Yet the man lifted a hand in a gesture that asked for permission to continue, not protection. And when the chief gave a single nod, the man felt a steadiness rise within him that he had not known since before fear had ruined his life 2 winters ago. He stopped halfway across the clearing, close enough that the ranch riders could see the exhaustion etched into his face and the hollow honesty in his eyes. And he spoke loudly so they would hear every word, admitting, without excuse or embellishment, that the woman who died had done so while saving him, and that his fear and inexperience had caused the stampede that injured their friends and then shattered the life of the man standing behind him. He told them he had run not to escape justice, but because he believed he was unworthy of facing the husband of the woman he owed his life to, and that every mile he had walked since had been a punishment far deeper than any frontier noose could have offered. His voice cracked as he said he would not allow Apache blood to be shed for his sake, that he would give himself freely if it meant the riders would turn back and let the chief's people remain untouched by a tragedy they had no hand in creating. The ranch hands hesitated, their anger wavering under the weight of a confession spoken with the rawness of a man who had nothing left to protect. And some lowered their rifles by instinct, uncertain whether vengeance could stand firm in the face of such humility. Behind him, the Apache warriors watched with stillness that carried both pride and sorrow, recognizing the bravery in a man who finally chose truth over fear. The chief stepped forward then, placing himself at the killer's side, not to block him, but to stand with him. And the sight of the two men together, one who had lost a wife, the other who had lost himself, stilled even the wind across the canyon. In that moment, courage was not the willingness to die, but the willingness to be seen completely. And the man understood that the path he had feared for years had finally opened beneath his feet, shaped not by violence, but by the truth he had carried alone for far too long. For a long moment after the man finished speaking, the canyon fell into a silence so deep it swallowed even the restless breath of the horses. And the ranch riders who had come burning with anger found themselves staring not at a fugitive, but at a man stripped bare of pride, fear, and defense, offering himself with a resolve they had not expected to see. The chief stepped forward to stand beside him, not shielding him, but acknowledging that the truth now belonged to both of them, their lives forever knotted by the woman whose courage had once bridged the same distance. The leader of the ranch riders nudged his horse down the slope, his rifle still in hand but lowered, his expression shifting from fury to something more unsettled as he studied the killer's trembling shoulders and the calm authority in the chief's stance. He demanded to know why the chief would protect the man who had taken his wife's life. And the chief replied that his wife had not died at the hands of hatred, but at the hands of fear, and that her spirit would not want vengeance carried out in a way that twisted her final act of mercy into bitterness. The ranch leader looked between the two men, torn by his own grief for the riders who had been injured and the long months of anger he had allowed to guide him. And at last, he admitted that he had come expecting a confrontation, not a confession that left little room for violence. One of the younger riders dismounted, stepping closer to say that he had been there the day of the stampede and had seen the killer try, clumsily, desperately, to stop the herd before panic overtook him, adding that guilt had likely punished him more deeply than any bullet ever could. Murmurs rippled through the ranchmen as they began lowering their firearms, the fire of vengeance cooling into something quieter, shaped by truth spoken in the open air. The chief turned to the killer and asked whether he would accept a judgment that balanced accountability with mercy. And the man nodded, saying he would obey whatever decision honored the woman who had died because he was too young and frightened to match her courage. The chief then addressed the riders, stating that justice would be carried out under Apache and territorial law together, without bloodshed, without humiliation, and without the cycle of anger that had already taken too much from all of them. Surprisingly, the ranch leader agreed, saying he had no wish to spill blood now that he had seen the depth of the man's remorse and the dignity with which the chief carried his loss. In that fragile but steady moment, union formed. Not friendship, not forgiveness, but a shared understanding that the woman's death would not become the seed of greater violence. The ranch riders turned their horses and left the pass one by one, and as the dust settled behind them, the chief placed a hand on the killer's shoulder. Not in comfort, but in acknowledgement that justice had been shaped by truth, not fury. In the days that followed the standoff in the canyon, a gentler rhythm settled over the land, as if the wind itself recognized the shift that had taken place between the two men bound by the same loss. The killer remained under the chief's watch, not as a prisoner, but as a man allowed to rebuild himself through work, humility, and the slow, steady shaping of truth into something that could stand upright in the world. He helped repair the corral fences, carried water from the creek, and tended the horses with hands that still trembled at times, though less from fear now and more from the weight of being given a chance he had never expected. The Apache people watched him with a cautious but growing acceptance, for they saw the sincerity in his labor and the quiet way he stepped aside during ceremonies, acknowledging that he walked on ground, touched by a woman whose life had meant more than any single story could hold. Each evening, the chief joined him near the edge of the village where the land dipped into a soft valley, and they spoke not of death, but of memory, of the woman's laugh, her bare-handed way of calming a spooked horse, and the fierce kindness that had guided every choice she made. The killer listened with a reverence shaped by guilt and gratitude, understanding that the chief was teaching him not to erase the past, but to honor it without letting it consume him. When the circuit judge finally arrived from the territorial town, accompanied by a translator and 2 deputies, the chief presented the full account of what had happened, speaking not to excuse the man, but to describe the truth plainly, without bitterness. The judge, moved by the depth of remorse and the testimony of both Apache and ranch riders, ruled that the killer would work under the supervision of the Apache community for a season, offering labor as restitution rather than facing a hanging that would serve no true justice. When the ruling was read, the killer bowed his head, tears slipping down a face etched by years of punishing himself. For the judgment felt heavier than death in some ways, yet far more deserving of the woman who had given her life to protect him. The chief placed a horse before him, a gentle bay mare once favored by his wife, and told him that when the season ended, he would ride from their land not as a fugitive, but as a man who had carried his truth with honor. The killer touched the mare's neck with trembling fingers, feeling the quiet forgiveness in the chief's choice. And in that moment, he understood that the path ahead would be shaped by labor, honesty, and the memory of a woman whose spirit had bridged the distance between justice and mercy. At dusk, as the chief walked with him to the valley's edge, the killer felt a peace settle inside him. Not the absence of sorrow, but the presence of purpose. Some wounds heal not through forgetting, but through the courage to walk in truth. Thank you for sharing this quiet trail of mercy, justice, and remembrance. May every honest step you take carry you toward gentler ground.